The road was still cool beneath the tires, the kind of early morning where the world hadn't quite decided to wake up. The car moved steadily forward, engine low and even, the radio barely audible. Fences passed, then fields, then stretches of nothing at all. It was a familiar drive, repeated often enough to lose novelty but never long enough to feel automatic. Movement itself felt reassuring. As long as the wheels kept turning, something was being done. On the passenger seat, a notebook lay closed. It had been there before. Sometimes it was opened. Sometimes it wasn't. Either way, its presence mattered more than its use. It suggested that the future might still be written, even if no one yet knew what it would say. Long before there was a company anyone recognized, before logos and slogans and expectations, there was this same feeling of motion without clarity. A sense of going forward without a map. It didn't arrive as confidence. It arrived as restlessness, as the quiet refusal to settle too early into something that felt finished before it began. Running had provided an early structure for that restlessness. Not the spectacle of winning, but the discipline of repetition. Day after day, the body learned what effort meant. There was no negotiation with distance or time. Either the miles were run or they weren't. That honesty stayed. It shaped how progress was understood. Incremental. Demanding. Earned without guarantees. At Stanford, the questions became harder to ignore. Classrooms were filled with ambition, spoken and unspoken. Everyone seemed to be preparing for something important, though few could name it clearly. In between lectures and conversations, a quiet pressure built. What comes next? What is this all for? The answers offered by tradition felt incomplete. An idea surfaced slowly, almost by accident, while working through an assignment. It was meant to be theoretical. An analysis of global markets, of how manufacturing was shifting, of how Japan was producing goods that challenged old assumptions about quality and cost. Cameras. Electronics. Precision. The thought arrived without drama. If they could do that, why not shoes? Why not running shoes? At first, it lived safely on the page. Words arranged neatly, supported by data. But once written, it refused to stay contained. It followed into quiet moments, into the spaces where certainty usually lived. It suggested, gently but persistently, that it wanted to be tested. After graduation, instead of choosing a direct path, movement continued. A trip around the world offered no clear objective beyond exposure. Europe passed through quickly. Asia lingered. Each place revealed something different about how work could be done, how value could be created. There was no single lesson, just accumulation. Observation layered upon observation. Japan provided the turning point, though it did not announce itself as such. In a small office, across from people with no reason to place trust in an unproven visitor, the idea was spoken aloud for the first time. Not polished. Not rehearsed. Just honest. A proposal to bring their running shoes to America, to introduce them to athletes who cared about performance more than pedigree. The response was cautious. Questions were asked. Silence filled the spaces between answers. When the meeting ended, there was no triumph, only possibility. A handshake. An agreement to send samples. It was enough to keep moving. Back home, reality asserted itself quickly. Living with parents again. Working as an accountant during the day. The distance between the idea and its execution felt vast. When the shoes arrived, they did so quietly, without ceremony. Boxes stacked in bedrooms and garages, waiting. They carried potential, but also risk. Every pair represented money already spent and hope not yet validated. Selling began simply. Shoes were taken to track meets and sold from the trunk of a car. Conversations were direct. Runners asked how they felt, how they held up, whether they were worth the price. There was no script. Answers were given carefully, because trust was the only currency available. Each exchange mattered. Money remained tight. It always would. What came and went out again, usually before it could settle. Inventory required payment. Shipping demanded patience. Profit was discussed more than it was experienced. What sustained the effort was momentum. As long as something moved, even slowly, it felt possible to continue. Help arrived through people rather than plans. A former coach joined, intense and uncompromising, focused entirely on performance. Others followed, drawn less by security than by the strange appeal of building something uncertain. Titles mattered little. Everyone did what needed to be done. The work was messy, but it was real. Problems appeared immediately. Manufacturing errors. Delays. Cash shortages. Each one demanded attention, and none arrived with instructions. The temptation to stop surfaced quietly, usually late at night, framed as practicality rather than fear. But stopping required a decision. Continuing did not. The path of least resistance pointed forward. Over time, something shifted. The company began to feel less like an experiment and more like a responsibility. Runners returned for another pair. Word spread without encouragement. Trust accumulated slowly, mile by mile. The idea had taken on weight. The road outside the car stretched ahead, unchanged. The notebook remained closed, but it no longer felt empty. It carried the imprint of everything already set in motion. Whatever came next would build on that movement, imperfect and unfinished, but undeniably real. Morning settled into a pattern that felt dependable from the outside and precarious from within. Coffee steamed in a familiar mug. Papers spread across a small desk that had never been meant to carry this much weight. Numbers were checked, then checked again, not because they were complex, but because their implications lingered. The ledger offered clarity without comfort. It showed what was there, not what was needed. The accounting job paid reliably. It provided structure, a sense of order that the rest of life lacked. But the hours spent there felt borrowed, as though attention had been divided without permission. Even in meetings, thoughts drifted toward shipments still at sea or phone calls waiting to be returned. The real work did not begin until evening, after ties were loosened and expectations elsewhere had been satisfied. At home, boxes multiplied. They lined walls and filled corners, reshaping the space quietly. Each pair of shoes carried the same dual meaning. Opportunity and risk, inseparable. If they sold, another order could be placed. If they didn't, they became evidence of a mistake that could not be easily corrected. The margin for error remained thin, and it stayed that way. Selling remained personal because it had to. Track meets became temporary storefronts. Trunks opened. Shoes were handed over, examined, laced, tested in short strides along the pavement. Questions came directly and were answered the same way. Runners could sense hesitation. They could also sense honesty. Trust was built in those moments, without amplification, without protection. The relationship with the Japanese supplier grew slowly, shaped by letters that crossed the ocean with careful phrasing. Time zones ensured that misunderstandings had time to settle before they could be addressed. Respect developed, but it was accompanied by imbalance. One side manufactured. The other side hoped. Dependence moved in both directions, though it was felt differently. As orders increased, complexity followed. Larger shipments required larger commitments. Payments had to be sent before revenue arrived. Banks noticed the activity, not with enthusiasm, but with concern. Conversations shifted tone. Questions grew sharper. Loans were extended cautiously, then reconsidered just as quickly. Each meeting carried an unspoken evaluation of whether this effort was sustainable or simply delayed failure. The former coach stepped in more fully then, bringing intensity that left little room for ambiguity. He saw shoes as instruments, not accessories. Performance mattered more than presentation. Conversations were blunt, occasionally abrasive, but always directed toward improvement. His standards were demanding, and meeting them required constant iteration. Nothing stayed finished for long. Disagreements surfaced regularly. They centered on design, on timing, on how much risk was acceptable. These were not philosophical debates. They were practical, urgent, and sometimes uncomfortable. Yet beneath them was alignment. If this was going to exist at all, it needed to be taken seriously. Half measures would only prolong disappointment. New people joined quietly, often without fully understanding what they were walking into. Titles were flexible. Responsibilities overlapped. Everyone learned by doing because there was no alternative. The office, such as it was, felt alive with motion. Phones rang. Papers shifted. Conversations overlapped and resolved themselves imperfectly. Legal concerns appeared unexpectedly, formal and unsettling. Established competitors took notice, not because the company posed an immediate threat, but because it existed at all. Letters arrived written in language designed to intimidate. For a moment, they worked. The idea that something so fragile could be challenged so decisively was sobering. Still, retreat never felt like a solution. Too much had already been committed. Fatigue settled in gradually. It showed up in small compromises, in decisions deferred until morning, in the shortening of patience. Sleep came lightly, interrupted by calculations that refused resolution. Morning arrived regardless. Coffee was poured again. The same numbers waited. Somewhere within the repetition, identity began to take shape. Not the public identity of a brand, but the internal one of a builder who no longer questioned intention. Doubt remained present, but it no longer dominated. It had become part of the background, a constant hum rather than a stopping force. The road ahead offered no clarity, but it was no longer empty. It was lined with obligations, relationships, and a growing sense that turning back would require more explanation than continuing forward. Whatever this was becoming, it asked to be carried further. The office moved again, not because it was ready, but because it had to. Rent rose, space tightened, and the work continued to spill outward. Desks were reassembled with familiar efficiency. Phones were plugged in wherever they reached. Boxes were stacked, then unstacked, then stacked again. Each move carried the same hope, that this location might hold long enough for things to stabilize. Nothing ever fully stabilized. Timing governed everything. Shipments needed to arrive when promised. Payments needed to leave before patience expired. A delay in one place echoed everywhere else. There were no buffers, no departments designed to absorb mistakes. When something went wrong, it landed immediately, demanding attention before anything else could continue. The relationship with the Japanese manufacturer deepened under this pressure. Trust grew through necessity, but so did strain. Expectations sharpened. Schedules slipped. Quality varied in ways that could not be ignored. Each issue required careful negotiation, carried out across distance and language, where tone mattered as much as content. Politeness softened conversations, but it did not resolve them. Resolution required persistence. Travel became routine, not as privilege but as obligation. Being present solved problems faster than letters ever could. Factory floors were walked slowly, deliberately. Materials were handled. Stitching examined. Processes questioned. Conversations unfolded through translation, meaning filtered and sometimes distorted, but effort recognized on both sides. Progress came in increments, earned through repetition rather than agreement. Back home, the running community was changing. The sport was expanding, drawing people who saw running not only as competition, but as identity. Shoes were no longer just equipment. They carried meaning. This shift was not predicted, but it was felt. There was space forming for something that felt authentic rather than imposed. Marketing remained understated by design. Word of mouth did the heavy lifting. Athletes wore the shoes because they trusted them, not because they were instructed to. Endorsements were approached cautiously. The wrong association could undermine months of quiet credibility. Each decision was weighed not only for reach, but for alignment with the people actually using the product. Financial pressure intensified rather than eased. Growth demanded capital. Capital demanded reassurance. Banks grew increasingly uneasy with a business that reinvested nearly everything it earned and still required more. Meetings became formal. Terms tightened. Support came with conditions that left little room for misstep. There were moments when the numbers refused to cooperate. Even optimistic projections fell short. In those moments, the future narrowed. Options were considered, none of them satisfying. Pulling back risked stagnation. Pushing forward risked collapse. The decision was rarely discussed openly, but it was consistently made. Forward. The culture inside the company hardened under strain. Long hours became expected without being announced. People stayed late because leaving felt premature. Arguments surfaced and resolved quickly. There was no time to hold on to resentment. Everyone understood, implicitly, that survival required cooperation more than comfort. Leadership evolved without instruction. Decisions were made quickly, sometimes revisited just as quickly. Authority was not enforced through hierarchy, but through responsibility. When something failed, ownership was taken. That accountability carried weight. It shaped trust more effectively than any title could. Competitors began to watch more closely. Some dismissed the effort as temporary, a reaction to a passing trend. Others adjusted their strategies quietly, acknowledging the presence of something they could not ignore. Being noticed felt validating and unsettling in equal measure. Visibility reduced anonymity, and anonymity had once offered protection. Legal challenges continued to appear, formal and draining. Each one demanded time, attention, and resources already stretched thin. Still, backing down was never seriously considered. Concession felt like an invitation to further pressure. Resistance, though costly, felt necessary. Through it all, running remained the reference point. It grounded decisions in something physical and honest. The product was not abstract. It was meant to endure impact, to move with the body, to support effort rather than distract from it. That clarity cut through complexity when decisions became overwhelming. Days stacked quietly, each one carrying its own demands. Progress was uneven, sometimes invisible, but cumulative. The company no longer felt like a test waiting to be graded. It felt like an obligation that now existed independently of doubt or fatigue. What had begun as an idea had taken on weight. It demanded attention and endurance. And it showed no inclination to slow down. Pressure accumulated without announcing itself. It arrived quietly, layered over ordinary routines, until everything required effort simply to maintain. Each success created expectation. Each expansion introduced obligations that could not be ignored. Momentum, once fragile, now needed protection. Letting it stall felt dangerous in ways that were difficult to articulate. Cash remained the central concern, shaping decisions before they were fully formed. Sales increased, but expenses kept pace. Inventory had to be committed to months in advance, paid for long before its value could be realized. Manufacturing required confidence that bordered on faith. The gap between what was owed and what was earned stretched thin, held together by timing and trust rather than certainty. Banks grew more cautious. Meetings carried a sharper tone. Questions focused less on potential and more on exposure. Terms tightened. Each extension of credit felt provisional, granted with the quiet expectation that circumstances might change without warning. The sense of being evaluated never faded. Every number seemed to carry an implied judgment. Inside the company, roles continued to blur under necessity. People adapted quickly, taking on responsibilities that shifted week to week. Learning happened in real time, often after mistakes had already left their mark. The pace left little room for reflection. Adjustments were made while moving, decisions corrected as consequences became clear. Design work intensified. Shoes were no longer meant to compete quietly. They were expected to stand out, to offer something unmistakable without straying into novelty. Small details mattered more than before. A change in cushioning altered perception. A slight shift in weight changed how a runner trusted the shoe. Feedback was gathered relentlessly, debated, tested, then revised again. Completion remained temporary. Athletes noticed the improvements. Some spoke openly, others simply returned. Their loyalty felt earned, and because it was earned, it felt fragile. Each release carried the awareness that expectations had risen. Meeting them required consistency rather than inspiration. Reliability became its own form of ambition. Expansion followed demand. Regional growth gave way to national presence. With it came logistical challenges that could not be solved through improvisation alone. Systems were introduced cautiously, each one weighed against the fear of losing flexibility. Structure promised stability, but it also threatened to slow responsiveness. Balancing those forces required constant attention. The founder's role shifted almost without acknowledgement. Direct involvement in every decision became impossible. Letting go happened gradually, often reluctantly. Delegation offered relief, but it also introduced vulnerability. Outcomes were now shaped by others' judgments, their interpretations of priorities that had once been implicit. Personal life adjusted unevenly. Time compressed around obligations. Relationships adapted where they could and strained where they couldn't. The work demanded presence even when absence was felt elsewhere. Rest became conditional, something to be negotiated rather than assumed. Competition intensified. Established brands responded with resources and visibility that dwarfed anything this growing company could access. Marketing grew louder. Innovation accelerated. Standing apart required clarity of purpose rather than volume. Chasing others' moves felt reactive. Holding direction felt essential. Late at night, reflection surfaced without invitation. Questions emerged about sustainability, about whether pace and pressure could be maintained indefinitely. There were no clear answers. Only the recognition that stopping would introduce its own costs, ones that could not be measured easily. The work continued because it had to. Each day brought a new set of variables, reshaped by whatever had unfolded before. There was no final arrival point in sight, only the steady accumulation of responsibility. What had once been optional now required commitment. Uncertainty remained, but it no longer felt temporary. It felt permanent, woven into the structure of the work itself. The days grew louder without becoming clearer. Phones rang with greater urgency. Calendars filled with meetings that overlapped and bled into one another. Decisions stacked faster than they could be resolved. What had once felt like a small group moving together now felt like a structure in motion, heavy enough that even minor adjustments required effort. Growth had introduced momentum, but it had also introduced resistance. Manufacturing demands intensified. Larger orders promised better margins, but they magnified every flaw. A defect that once affected dozens now threatened thousands. Quality control shifted from concern to obsession. Every visit to the factories carried an unspoken tension. Problems had to be identified before they crossed the ocean and hardened into public failure. There was no room left for casual oversight. Distance strained communication. Messages lost tone. Assumptions filled gaps where clarity should have been. Frustration accumulated quietly, often expressed through restraint rather than confrontation. Trust remained, but it required attention. It could no longer survive on goodwill alone. It needed consistency, proof, repetition. Inside the company, ambition diversified. People brought their own ideas about what the future should be. That diversity created energy, but it also created friction. Alignment could no longer be assumed. Conversations that once ended quickly now unfolded slowly, shaped by negotiation rather than instinct. Leadership meant listening longer than felt comfortable and deciding later than felt ideal. Marketing began to formalize, reluctantly. The idea of shaping perception felt risky, too close to artifice. Authenticity had carried the brand this far, and there was fear that refining it would dilute what made it resonate. Still, visibility demanded coherence. Messages needed consistency. The story needed structure, even if it resisted embellishment. Athletes were no longer just customers. They had become symbols, representatives of something larger. Choosing who to support and how to support them carried implications beyond performance. Values entered the equation, sometimes quietly, sometimes forcefully. The brand began to stand for things whether those positions were intentionally chosen or not. Responsibility followed without waiting to be acknowledged. Financial strain returned in familiar form, then intensified. Cash shortages forced difficult conversations. Payroll dates loomed. Inventory waited unpaid. The margin between solvency and collapse narrowed to uncomfortable proximity. There were nights when sleep broke repeatedly, interrupted by calculations that refused resolution. Numbers ran in circles, never quite landing on certainty. In those moments, the question of why resurfaced. Not dramatically, but persistently. Why continue pushing against constraints that seemed structural rather than temporary? Why choose uncertainty again when stability remained available? The answers were rarely articulated. They existed more as sensation than explanation. A sense that stopping would introduce a different kind of loss. The culture absorbed the strain unevenly. Some people found purpose in urgency, energized by the demand for solutions. Others withdrew quietly, deciding that the cost outweighed the reward. Departures happened without spectacle, leaving absences that altered the balance. Each change required adjustment from those who remained. External recognition grew, uneven and sometimes unwelcome. Praise arrived alongside criticism, often from people who understood only fragments of the story. Visibility meant being interpreted, sometimes inaccurately. Correcting every misunderstanding was impossible. Accepting that became part of the work. Amid the noise, moments of clarity still appeared. A prototype that felt right the first time it was worn. A runner's quiet satisfaction after a race. A team member solving a problem no one else had noticed. These moments did not resolve larger tensions, but they grounded the effort. They reminded everyone involved why the work continued at all. The company no longer felt young, but it did not yet feel settled. It existed in an in-between state, defined by contradiction. Agile but burdened. Confident but cautious. Ambitious but constrained. Navigating that tension required constant attention and a willingness to adapt without losing direction. Each day ended without closure. Something always remained unfinished, deferred to the morning. And morning always returned, bringing the same demands reshaped slightly by whatever had happened before. The work continued not because it promised resolution, but because it had become inseparable from identity. Public attention arrived without asking permission. Articles appeared that tried to compress years of uncertainty into a few confident paragraphs. They spoke of momentum and success as if both had been obvious from the beginning. Inside the company, nothing felt settled. Visibility did not reduce uncertainty. It sharpened it. Being seen meant being measured, often by standards that shifted without notice. Growth demanded structure, and structure brought resistance. Systems were introduced to manage scale, to catch errors before they multiplied. With them came rules and reporting, processes that slowed things just enough to be felt. The fear was not inefficiency. It was losing the looseness that had allowed people to respond intuitively, to solve problems without waiting for permission. Each new layer required justification. Leadership changed shape under these conditions. Action gave way to restraint. Not every issue could be addressed personally anymore. Intervening too often weakened confidence elsewhere. Stepping back felt unnatural, almost irresponsible, but it became necessary. Trust had to replace control, even when outcomes felt uncertain. Watching decisions unfold differently than expected required patience that did not come easily. The market continued to shift. Trends rose quickly and disappeared just as fast. What felt innovative one season risked becoming ordinary the next. Staying relevant required attention without obsession, responsiveness without panic. Innovation had to remain rooted in the needs of athletes rather than reactions to competitors. Losing that balance would mean chasing rather than leading. Inside the company, conversations turned toward sustainability. Not in abstract terms, but practical ones. How to grow without exhausting the people responsible for that growth. How to maintain clarity as imitation increased. How to protect values that had never been formally written down but were widely understood. These discussions did not produce immediate answers. They shaped alignment gradually, through repetition and shared experience. Financial realities remained persistent. Even as revenue climbed, profitability stayed elusive. Reinvestment consumed nearly everything. Each year felt like a wager placed on the next. Confidence was required to continue, but confidence without evidence risked becoming denial. The tension between belief and proof never fully resolved. It simply became familiar. Personal milestones passed quietly. Time moved forward without waiting for readiness. Relationships adjusted, sometimes stretched thin by absence and distraction. The work demanded presence even when the body was elsewhere. Letting go, even briefly, felt risky, as though something essential might loosen without constant attention. The company's identity clarified through accumulation rather than declaration. Decisions made under pressure revealed priorities more clearly than any statement could. Choices about partnerships, responses to criticism, and investments in people left traces. Over time, those traces formed a pattern others could recognize, even if it was never explicitly defined. There were moments when exhaustion gave way to reflection. Not dramatic reassessments, but quiet acknowledgments of distance traveled. Looking back revealed how improbable the path had been, how many points of failure had been passed without recognition. That awareness did not inspire comfort. It reinforced humility. Survival had depended on persistence as much as insight. Competition intensified again. What had once been dismissed as temporary was now treated seriously. Responses became calculated. Marketing battles played out publicly, while strategic conflicts unfolded behind closed doors. The stakes felt higher, but the approach remained measured. Reacting emotionally offered relief without advantage. Amid everything, the original impulse still lingered. A belief that products should serve people honestly. That performance mattered. That trust, once earned, was worth protecting even when it came at a cost. These ideas were no longer new, but they remained essential. They anchored decisions when options multiplied and clarity thinned. The work continued, shaped less by excitement and more by responsibility. What had begun as an experiment had become an institution in the making. Carrying it forward required endurance rather than inspiration, consistency rather than urgency. Progress was quieter now, but no less demanding. The shift revealed itself gradually, without ceremony. Decisions that once felt flexible began to settle into place with a sense of permanence. Contracts extended further into the future. Commitments narrowed the range of available choices. The business had entered a phase where momentum could no longer be redirected casually. Each step forward closed a door behind it, sometimes without anyone pausing to notice. International growth accelerated in uneven ways. New markets opened with familiar complications, shaped by customs and expectations that resisted standard solutions. Distribution behaved unpredictably. Relationships required patience before they produced clarity. What worked at home needed translation elsewhere, not just of language, but of assumption. Expansion demanded attention rather than confidence. Inside the company, specialization increased. Roles that had once been fluid hardened into defined responsibilities. Efficiency improved, but intimacy faded. Fewer people understood the entire operation. Trust had to move across layers now, carried by reports and meetings instead of shared effort. Communication required intention. Silence no longer meant understanding. The founders' days filled with conversations that rarely touched the product directly. Strategy replaced execution. Legal matters demanded focus. Advisory relationships expanded the scope of responsibility far beyond anything once imagined. The work became abstract, removed from the tactile origins that had given it clarity. Influence replaced action as the primary instrument, and influence moved slowly. That distance produced a quiet tension. There was a sense of loss, not for difficulty, but for immediacy. In the early days, problems could be addressed with effort and presence. Now, issues unfolded over months, shaped by forces that could not be confronted directly. Progress required patience rather than urgency, foresight rather than reaction. Public perception continued to solidify. Stories circulated that framed the journey as inevitable, a clean arc from idea to success. Those narratives rarely captured fragility. They overlooked compromise, doubt, and the accumulation of near failures that had shaped every outcome. Being misunderstood became part of visibility's cost, something to be carried without resentment. Internally, values faced quieter tests. Opportunities appeared that promised growth at the expense of coherence. Each offer arrived with justification. Each refusal carried consequence. Drawing boundaries required clarity that precedent could not provide. These decisions shaped the company in lasting ways, even when they passed without notice. The relationship with athletes evolved again. Endorsements became structured. Expectations formalized. Success created leverage on both sides. Managing those dynamics required restraint. Performance remained central, but it now existed within contracts and public narratives that demanded careful navigation. Authenticity required maintenance. Financial patterns persisted, though their scale changed. Cash flow challenges did not disappear with size. They transformed. Numbers grew larger. Risk carried more weight. Stability replaced survival as the immediate concern, but certainty remained out of reach. Each expansion introduced vulnerabilities that demanded vigilance. Reflection surfaced more often, not as doubt, but as reckoning. Time had accumulated. The work had shaped identity so thoroughly that imagining life outside it felt abstract. That realization carried both pride and unease. Purpose had been found, but alternatives had narrowed. Moments of grounding still appeared. A prototype examined quietly. A conversation with a runner whose feedback cut through abstraction. A visit to a factory floor where the work remained physical and immediate. These moments restored perspective. They reminded intention of its origin. The future remained undefined, but no longer empty. It was crowded with commitments and expectations, with people whose livelihoods were tied to decisions made far from the starting line. Carrying that weight required steadiness rather than speed. Progress continued, measured not by excitement, but by continuity. The company moved forward because stopping was no longer neutral. What had been built demanded stewardship. The work had changed, but the obligation remained, steady and persistent, asking to be carried further. The idea of becoming a public company surfaced gradually, never announced as a goal, never framed as ambition. It arrived instead as a pressure, revisited in meetings that ended without resolution and returned again weeks later. The scale of operations had outgrown familiar sources of capital. Private arrangements strained under their own limitations. Each new season required commitments that could no longer be supported by improvisation alone. The conversations surrounding this shift were careful and restrained. No one pretended it was purely strategic. Emotion sat just beneath the surface. Opening the company to public ownership meant surrendering a kind of privacy that had protected decision-making for years. Numbers would be exposed without context. Intentions would be interpreted without access to nuance. Control would thin, redistributed among people who knew the company only through reports and projections. Preparation unfolded methodically. Financial histories were reconstructed in detail. Assumptions made years earlier were examined with new precision. Inconsistencies that had once been absorbed by momentum now required explanation. The past was no longer something that could be remembered loosely. It had to be documented, justified, aligned. The work was mentally dense, exacting in ways that left little room for sentiment. Inside the company, reactions varied quietly. Some felt relief, seeing validation in the process, proof that years of uncertainty had produced something durable. Others felt exposed. The culture that had thrived on discretion and flexibility faced a different discipline now. Transparency replaced intuition. Predictability became an expectation rather than an aspiration. As preparations advanced, the distance from the early days became unavoidable. Selling shoes from a car trunk felt like a memory from another life, still vivid but no longer connected to daily experience. The scale now was abstract, measured in percentages and forecasts rather than individual exchanges. That distance carried a quiet sense of loss, not for hardship, but for intimacy. The offering itself unfolded without ceremony from the inside. There were no dramatic moments, no sudden clarity. Just a sequence of tasks completed under scrutiny. Deadlines met. Documents filed. Conversations repeated with minor variations. The significance registered indirectly, through reactions rather than experience. Headlines appeared. Numbers moved. Ownership shifted invisibly. With the transition came relief that never fully settled. Immediate financial pressure eased, but new expectations took its place. Growth was no longer merely desired. It was required. Stability, once elusive, became the standard against which performance was judged. The margin for error narrowed again, reshaped rather than removed. The founder's role continued to change. Responsibility expanded outward, away from daily execution and toward stewardship of direction. Influence replaced action almost entirely. Decisions now carried longer timelines and broader consequences. The work required patience, an ability to think in years rather than weeks, while accepting that outcomes would always remain partially beyond reach. Public perception hardened into narratives that resisted correction. Success was assumed to be continuous and intentional. The fragility that still existed beneath the surface remained largely unseen. Each quarter brought uncertainty. Markets shifted. Competition adapted. Size did not equal safety. It simply altered the nature of risk. Internally, coherence became the challenge. Maintaining purpose across distance required articulation. Values could no longer rely on shared memory. They needed language, reinforcement, and repetition to survive growth and turnover. Culture became something that had to be actively carried rather than implicitly understood. Reflection deepened during this period, though it offered no closure. Milestones arrived without resolution. Achievement did not simplify the work. It complicated it. The question shifted from whether the effort mattered to how long it could be carried responsibly without distortion. There was no sense of arrival, only transition. What had begun as a restless idea had become something visible, consequential, and durable. Carrying it forward required acceptance that completion was never part of the arrangement. The work would continue, altered but unfinished, shaped by the same persistence that had set it in motion. Life after the offering did not slow the pace. If anything, it compressed time further. Days filled with obligations that resisted postponement, expectations that arrived fully formed and unmoved by context. Meetings now included people whose connection to the company existed only through numbers and forecasts. Their questions were precise, unemotional, and forward-facing. What would come next? How reliably? At what cost? Internally, adaptation became continuous rather than episodic. Being public required legibility. Decisions had to be explained in ways that could withstand scrutiny without hollowing out their meaning. The language of instinct and long-term belief needed translation into projections and assurances. That translation was never exact. Something was always flattened in the process, sacrificed for clarity. Time itself changed shape. Quarters replaced seasons. Performance was measured in cycles that moved faster than reflection could comfortably follow. Investing for the future demanded patience, but patience now existed under surveillance. Faith remained necessary, but it had to coexist with accountability. The balance was delicate and rarely settled. The company's reach expanded further, moving into spaces that once felt peripheral. New categories formed. New partnerships emerged. Each extension carried promise alongside complexity. The brand traveled faster than intention, interpreted and repurposed in ways that could not be fully controlled. Recognition brought momentum, but it also magnified missteps. Leadership required steadiness above all else. Reaction, once useful, now carried risk. Decisions needed to account for consequences that extended far beyond their point of origin. A single statement could ripple outward, altering perception across markets. Silence, too, carried meaning. Choosing when to speak and when to wait became part of the discipline. Personal distance from daily operations increased. The work shifted toward oversight, toward ensuring continuity rather than initiating change. Letting others lead was no longer optional. It was essential. Trust expanded outward, not because it was comfortable, but because the alternative would have stalled everything. Looking back offered no temptation to simplify. The early years remained intact in memory, their uncertainty undiluted. Success had not rewritten them. It had only reframed them. Risk, doubt, and near failure were not anomalies. They were structural elements. They explained the caution that persisted even amid achievement. The company's story began to circulate independently, studied and retold by people searching for formulas. Those versions often substituted intention for improvisation, vision for endurance. Accepting misinterpretation became part of visibility's cost. Correction was rarely possible and rarely worth the effort. There were moments of satisfaction, though they arrived quietly. Seeing the product integrated into everyday life without ceremony. Watching athletes trust it without needing explanation. Observing teams operate with competence and care, solving problems that no longer required intervention. These moments did not ask for acknowledgement. They stood on their own. The future remained unsettled. Markets would change. Leadership would shift. Challenges would arrive without warning. Preparing for that uncertainty meant resisting complacency and remaining attentive to principles that had guided earlier decisions. Scale did not absolve responsibility. It amplified it. As the days continued, the work retained its essential shape. Showing up. Choosing with incomplete information. Accepting responsibility for outcomes that could not be fully controlled. The context had changed. The core had not. There was no sense of closure, only continuity. What had begun with a simple idea and a willingness to try had grown into something that demanded care rather than conquest. Carrying it forward required presence more than certainty, steadiness more than speed. The road did not resolve itself. It simply continued. Time settled into a different rhythm, not slower, but steadier. The sharp urgency that once pressed against every decision softened into something more deliberate. Problems still arrived, but they no longer carried the same threat of collapse. Experience provided context. Context reduced panic. What once felt precarious now felt familiar, even when it remained difficult. Attention turned increasingly toward preservation rather than acceleration. The question shifted from how much more could be done to how carefully what already existed could be carried forward. Success introduced a new kind of fragility. Reputation required protection. Culture required renewal. Momentum, once driven by risk, now depended on restraint and judgment. Transitions began to matter in ways they hadn't before. Leadership evolved with intention rather than necessity. Letting go became an act of responsibility instead of reluctance. New voices stepped into roles shaped by a world very different from the one in which the company had begun. Allowing those perspectives space required trust, even when it felt unfamiliar. Continuity demanded it. Reflection arrived more often, usually without prompting. Memories surfaced in fragments. Early drives before sunrise. Conversations held without certainty. Nights shaped by calculation rather than confidence. These moments did not feel distant. They felt foundational. They explained instincts that still guided decisions long after circumstances had changed. The company's influence now extended beyond product alone. Questions of labor, environment, and responsibility pressed inward. Engagement was no longer optional. Actions carried symbolic weight. Responding required humility, an acceptance that intention did not determine impact. Listening became as important as deciding. Control was no longer an illusion worth maintaining. The world moved independently, shaped by forces larger than any single organization. What remained possible was responsiveness. A willingness to adjust without abandoning principles. That balance required constant attention, not dramatic gestures. Personal identity shifted alongside professional distance. The work no longer filled every hour, though it remained deeply integrated. Space opened for perspective. Contribution no longer depended on constant presence. Stepping back did not diminish meaning. It clarified it. The company continued forward, increasingly shaped by people who would never know the uncertainty of its earliest days firsthand. That was not a loss. It was evidence of durability. What had been built could stand on its own, carrying traces of its origin without being confined by them. Looking ahead offered no final answers. Only a quiet understanding that endurance mattered more than dominance. That trust, once earned, required care rather than extraction. That progress was neither linear nor permanent. The road, in that sense, had never changed. It still stretched forward without guarantees, shaped by choice and chance in equal measure. The difference now was familiarity. Uncertainty no longer felt hostile. It felt honest. And so the work continued. Not as a pursuit of arrival, but as a commitment to motion. One decision leading into the next. One step following another. Not toward an ending, but along a path that had proven, over time, to be worth walking.